Welcome to War School, adventurers, where we're going to show you how to survive against the most vicious threats in the Monster Manual, triumph over your enemies, carry the day in battle.
We're looking at combat tactics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Welcome, warriors. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're talking about Combat Tactics 101 in D&D 5e.
We're going to show you how to master the basic mechanics of tactical combat in D&D with a real focus on making the most of the game rules to maximize your advantages in battle.
We're taking a look at how combat works within the rules, but we're not here to explain the rules to you, more just talk about how to use the rules properly.
It's about making the most of them, and while some people might consider this to be a metagame analysis of how combat works in D&D, tactics are an important part of the game and a really satisfying element of combat in D&D. Remember, Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game, so the narrative and the story doesn't stop just because the swords are drawn. We believe that there's so much creativity and freedom and flexibility in a tactical combat situation in D&D. So much so that we've decided to focus in this video just on those tactical elements, and we're going to have a part 2 to this video where we cover the creative and role-playing tactics and strategies that influence combat separately.
One of the beautiful things about D&D is that you're not confined by the same rules as video games. You can do anything that your imagination can come up with within the confines of the rule structure. And that's what really makes this a much more interesting game to play than, say, playing a video game.
However, there are common mechanical elements that are useful in any combat situation. These are ideas like target priority, how to use your character's abilities effectively, how to work as a team and manage your position in battle. These are the types of things that we're going to be focusing on this video.
So, let's get rolling.
Our 5 main tips for successful tactical combat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition boil down to this. The first one is working together effectively as a team.
And the second one is having target priority.
The third one is seizing a good position on the battlefield.
Fourth one is battlefield control.
And the final is a discussion of how to most effectively use your resources efficiently.
So let's take a look at each of these in greater detail, starting with working together.
The cornerstone of any good strategy is teamwork.
Stop, collaborate, and listen.
Indeed. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that Dungeons & Dragons is not a single-player experience. You aren't in control of the entire party. You have to work together and collaborate as a team.
Yeah, the teamwork of D&D is really what makes it a game. I have a lot of people who don't play D&D come up to me after a night of playing and say, "So, did you win?" And I say, well, there isn't really a winner in D&D. It's all of us working together to tell a story.
But there is a winner and a loser in every battle, and to make sure it's not you, you and your allies need to stand together. You want to make sure that everybody is working together in a coordinated fashion, or at the very least that people aren't stepping on each other's toes and derailing each other's plans in the middle of combat when you're supposed to be working together.
Yeah, you want to understand what everybody is going to be doing in that battle before you jump into it. Maybe not exactly, but you don't want everybody running off in their own directions with their own priorities and goals within a combat encounter. Otherwise, it's going to turn really messy really fast.
Now, those can make for some interesting role-playing game experiences, and of course, sometimes your character's personal motivations making things difficult for you in combat is such an interesting thing. But overall, you want to square those role-playing elements with still not creating a frustrating experience for everyone else at the table. So I find that it's important to have these conversations about what is your character good at? What are the abilities that you enjoy using as a player character, and how do they work? A big part of working together as a team is just making sure that you're using your abilities together in a way that you aren't stepping on each other's toes. When the fighter charges off to fight a separate foe and the rogue has nobody to flank with, now they can't use their sneak attack ability effectively.
Or the barbarian runs headfirst into battle into a group of enemies, leaving the wizard without his opportunity to cast that awesome fireball.
Or when everyone splits off in different directions so the cleric can't use their mighty protective spells to protect everyone all at once. These simple things of just making sure that you're staying in range of each other are the cornerstone of good teamwork. The most important thing about teamwork is that it's not appropriate to derail the game with a massive tactical discussion over what you're going to do next. And what's even worse than this is when you're bossing other people at the table around and demanding that they take specific actions on their turns. This kind of overarching and overbearing play is not conducive to good teamwork. And we recommend that if you and your group are interested in having a more tactical game, that you have these conversations before a combat encounter begins. You learn what your abilities and strategies are together, and you develop that teamwork outside a combat encounter so that you can execute it within combat.
As soon as combat starts, there's not really any time for you to be communicating back and forth on, okay, if you go over here and do this while I go and do this. That's not going to fly while battle has started. You can yell out simple commands back and forth like, I'm going to attack this guy. But really, if we're keeping up with the narrative and storytelling of D&D, you have to plan these things beforehand, before you jump into combat, before you start throwing out your spells or clashing swords. You want to know what the strengths of each of the party members are and what their weaknesses are, and how you guys can work together as a team to amplify the situation to benefit you and your strengths.
Yeah, a great way to do this is whenever your characters level up, just have a great conversation and tell your party members, hey, I just got this new feat, or I learned this new spell, and I'm really excited to use it. And that will spur a conversation within your group about how you might be able to use your abilities together to find interesting combinations. In many cases, the player characters, by working together effectively as a team, can execute some really elaborate and jaw-droppingly potent strategies. But it's worth having that conversation and finding out, oh, hey, if I use this ability, it's going to cause the rogue to get advantage, or it will cause disadvantage on saving throws for this enemy, so the wizard's spells are easier to land. Have these conversations about your abilities, because many of them work together really, really well. And the game is designed quite intentionally to focus each character to specialize just a little bit, so you have to work together as a team in order to survive.
Next up, we have target priority, and this is one that a lot of groups struggle with. Maybe I'm just saying that because our group struggles with it.
Our group really does, and I think it's a big reason why you get your butts kicked on a regular basis.
We all want to be the big damn hero. So what that means is that all of us look for a target that we think we can handle on our own and run off and try to fight it. What ends up happening is we take a lot longer in combat, and there's a lot more damage being dealt to us because we're not taking out a single foe.
One of the most important cornerstones of good teamwork is having everyone in the party concentrating their damage-dealing attacks against a single foe before moving on to the next. The impact that this has on all the other strategies and tactics that we're going to discuss is massive. We saw this really recently in one of our campaigns, where your characters were 10th level and you had a battle against 6 hill giants. And what happened was, I remember looking down as a DM and saying, each of these hill giants has lost about 50% of their hit points, but all of them are still alive. And in Dungeons & Dragons, it doesn't matter if you have 1 hit point remaining or all of them. It only matters once you reduce an enemy down to 0 hit points. And until then, every foe is always fighting at peak capacity. So if you spread the damage out across all the enemies and they remain alive for the entire combat encounter until the last fireball that takes them all out, your party is going to overall take a lot more damage than you would have had you targeted them each in sequence and slain your foes before moving on to the next.
3 hill giants would have done a lot less damage to us than the 6, but we left all 6 alive for way too long, and that was because we had no target priority. I'm pretty sure in that combat encounter we actually split off into 2 groups fighting the groups of giants. There were 3 and 3, and we never really kind of combined forces until near the end to take on the remaining ones as a group. But we should have probably started as a group and moved our way through those hill giants.
Sometimes splitting up can be a good strategy, but if you're just getting your handle on tactics for the very first time, it's often better to identify the most important target that needs to go down, or find the target that everyone in your party is capable of attacking. Another common occurrence that happens in some of our campaigns is that the rogue or the ranger, someone who has a good ranged attack or great mobility, decides to target a vulnerable enemy in the back ranks. And while they can do a lot of damage to that enemy, no one else in the party is capable of attacking that foe, which means that all the damage gets spread out again. So it's really important to identify. In many cases, it's better for everyone to attack the foe that every player character is capable of reaching, rather than going for the back line, just because they might be slightly more dangerous.
This is why fights against a single target enemy or a group that has a very obvious leader are usually much easier, because it's very easy for the group to rally behind, oh, we got to attack this one creature, or clearly we should attack the wizard, not his minions. That becomes obvious. It's when you have a whole bunch of different targets that it becomes a little bit more confusing, and where you want to try to get a focus going.
Just because you can't slay the biggest threat right away doesn't mean that you can't deal with them in other ways, which we're going to look at in some of the other strategies.
The next thing we're going to talk about is positioning, which is a very key element to succeeding in combat. You don't want your wizard on the front lines while your paladin's off in the back doing something else. You need to know where to position yourself to more advantageously handle the situation.
Now, this is something that can really vary depending on whether or not your group uses theater of the mind style combat or uses a tactical combat grid and miniatures. In a game group that is using a grid, your positioning is going to be super important, because that's going to be really, really detailed. But if you are using theater of the mind combat, positioning can still play an important part. It just might be slightly reduced because you don't have a visual representation, and thus it isn't highlighted as clearly as it might be in a tactical experience.
One thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about positioning is not just where you are in comparison to the rest of your teammates, but also where you are in the environment. Look around the environment. Find places to use to your advantage. If you're a ranged attacker or a spellcaster, maybe you want to hide behind something. Look for cover. Look for things that you can explode or manipulate. Look for anything in the environment that you can use as an advantage for your combat encounter.
Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition varies from a lot of video games because there isn't really a solid tanking game mechanic for fighters and paladins and barbarians to use. They can take a lot of damage and they have high AC, but there aren't many mechanics that actually force foes to attack you. That's why you have to seize the position and make sure that if you're a defensive type of character or a character that's capable of taking a lot of damage, that you're seizing a good position, you're out there in front, finding a bottleneck amongst your foes, but not necessarily one where you're going to be surrounded. The key to a good battle is finding a position where you have the elevation, where you have the ability to surround your foes, but they don't have the elevation or the way to surround you either. So be on the lookout for instances where your party might be entrapped and attacked from both sides, but look for the opposite where you might be able to do the same to your foes, because that can be a really big advantage.
If you think of Obi-Wan having the high ground, that was an advantageous position that he put himself in. Or if you think of the movie 300, where their entire discussion was how do 300 soldiers defeat an entire massive army by finding an advantageous place to fight.
At the same time, you really want to be careful about bunching up together as a group, because in Dungeons & Dragons, there are tons of crazy dangerous spells, not the least of which is the breath weapon of dragons. And if that dragon can catch your entire party in their breath weapon, you are going to have a bad time.
The DM likes nothing more than having that dragon swooping in, and the entire party groups together in a bunch and says, "Don't worry, we got this." And the DM's just thinking, "Oh man, they're all going to get burned, and it's going to be great."
This can also work against you, for instance, if the fighter and the barbarian decide to run ahead, get surrounded, and are in a position where the wizard or the sorcerer can't use their potent area of effect attacks to protect or slay those foes that might be surrounding them. As far as positioning goes, just remember that combat in Dungeons & Dragons does happen in 3 dimensions, and there are many interesting area of effect abilities that can actually be aimed in 3-dimensional ways, or you can always be thinking about what's happening above our heads. If you're fighting against flying foes, maybe there's a rooftop or an awning that you can jump up onto or hide underneath that prevents that flying foe from using their mobility against you. Positioning is more than just setting up a flanking for the rogue and making sure everyone's spread out from the breath weapon. It's a really creative element, so be on the lookout for ways that you can use it in strong ways.
The next thing we're going to look at is battlefield control. Not every person in your adventuring party is going to have access to abilities and spells that are battlefield control, but if you do, they're a great way to manipulate the battlefield in your favor.
Be on the lookout for really useful spells, such as sleep, hypnotic pattern, hold person, hold monster, that completely incapacitate foes, taking them out of the fight. Oftentimes, these spells can be more useful than dealing damage directly, especially in cases where your party might be outnumbered.
So with these battlefield control spells and abilities, this actually kind of does the opposite of what we talked about in target priority, where if you could take out a group of enemies and have them incapacitated for a while, that then allows you to then move on to the targets that are not incapacitated and deal with them. So it might be advantageous for the person who has maybe the sleep spell to put half of the enemies to sleep. The rest of the party then focuses on the remaining ones, and then you can deal with the battle after that.
This is why teamwork is so critical, because nothing is worse than the bard incapacitating a bunch of orcs with hypnotic pattern, only to have the wizard come along and fireball them, breaking them all out of the spell effect. Many battlefield control spells are contingent on those foes not being attacked, or even remove them from play entirely in the case of spells like banishment. So you want to make sure that you understand how these abilities work and use them in a careful way. If you're trying to cast the battlefield control effect to get the target that the entire party is already busy attacking, but they're going to snap out of it when they're hit with damage, it's not the most effective use of that spell.
You can also use spells like Web, Black Tentacles, or Wall of Force to really shape the battlefield in your favor.
I'm a really big fan of these spells because they also play really well with the notion of positioning. Because spells like Web and Black Tentacles and Wall of Force are actually creating and manipulating the terrain of the battlefield. So if there's not a bottleneck, you can create one. If there isn't a positional advantage, you can create it using these spells by forcing enemies to either get trapped in these areas of the spells or by moving into a position that forces them to fight the fighter head on.
One of the coolest examples that I have at my table was my party used two castings of Wall of Fire to create a funnel literally towards the barbarian who was standing there against an army of giants who then started to funnel in towards him, and he just ran out, and we called it the blender effect, where he just spun around with his axe while the two Wall of Fires stopped them from wanting to go out any further. It was a great tactic that really made that battle a lot easier for the party by using some cool spells and abilities.
This is why I absolutely love having several spellcasters in the party who really coordinate together. And this is why that conversation of teamwork is really, really important, because many of these battlefield control spells require a spellcaster's concentration, which means that you can only have one effect of them per player character, but you can combine them in really interesting ways, like using Wall of Force and Cloud Kill cast by two separate casters to basically create a perfect death chamber.
You also want to be mindful of how enemies can break out of a lot of these spells and abilities. Be aware of the ability to break out of them, because it could happen.
I'm especially mindful whenever I have a player character that uses these powerful battlefield control effects. I love nothing more than for them to set up their effect only to have the ranged attackers that they thought were out of range start peppering them with arrows to break their concentration. So I really find that battlefield control is a really important way to address enemies that might have ranged attacks, because they're the ones that are really capable of messing with your spellcasters in your back line. And using battlefield control effects that actually block line of sight from ranged attackers can be a really effective way of protecting your party from a lot of damage.
Lastly, we're going to talk about managing your resources. We're going to talk about basically how many resources you should put into a single combat encounter.
Knowing how to manage your resources really, really carefully is going to help you overcome more successive combat encounters before your party has to retreat and take a rest. Oftentimes, recognizing when you need to use your big guns and when you don't need to can make the difference between overcommitting to a battle and then thus not being able to win the next fight.
There have been many times that, for example, as a spellcaster, I have wanted to just burn through those high-level spells right away because they're the most exciting to cast, only to leave myself with very few and low number spell slots left when it came to the end battle where we were fighting a much more dangerous enemy.
If you start to get used to having only one combat encounter before your characters have to take a rest, you can get into a really bad habit where you're just used to blowing through your most powerful abilities at the slightest provocation. Now, this can make for a lot of fun in cinematic battles, but the reality of it is that a few well-chosen abilities working together as a team are often much more effective and much more efficient than everyone simply expending their most powerful abilities. Is it really necessary for the sorcerer to use all of their most damage-dealing spells if the bard successfully incapacitated most of the foes with hypnotic pattern? Probably not.
Yeah, the example that we gave before. Don't throw a fireball into a group of hypnotic patterned enemies. It's a waste of a spell slot when those enemies are already incapacitated.
Oftentimes, it can be really good to identify Do you need to throw out the most damage dealing abilities right now, especially if you're making good use of battlefield control, right? Sometimes it is important to make sure that that foe is slain as quickly as possible, in which case blast them with Disintegrate. Go all out and use your Oath of Enmity, smite on every single attack, and take them out as quickly as possible. But if one of your party members is overcommitting like that, if you've got the paladin that is using all of their smites, if you're working together as a team, it might be better for you as a player to not follow suit and overcommit in the same way as one of your other party members, so that way you in the next battle can be the one that overcommits, because the paladin has used all their powers and is reduced to just making their most basic attacks.
The general term going Nova refers to using all of your abilities as quickly as possible. If the whole party does this right at the start of a combat and you don't kill all the enemies, now what are you going to do?
When the entire party goes Nova, it's shocking what kind of threats they can overcome. I have seen parties that fully commit all their resources to a battle be able to take down foes that are twice their challenge rating, twice their level in challenge rating. It's really intimidating how powerful D&D characters are when they burn all the gas in the tank. But then those characters can get defeated by a trivial encounter that normally wouldn't pose any threat to them at all. I'm always very conscious of this as a DM, and I love nothing more than hitting a party that's overcommitted to a single battle with a follow-up fight that pushes them to their absolute limit.
To conclude, I think the most important thing for me when I'm jumping into a game of D&D is not only knowing what my character that I'm playing is capable of, but what all the players around the table are capable of as well. Knowing what our strengths and our weaknesses are and working off of those. I actually love having discussions after the game or before the game when we're all gathering around getting ready to play, saying, hey guys, I just got this really cool ability that allows me to do this. And then having somebody else at the table say, oh, that works really well with my ability to do this. And there we're already making really cool tactics and ideas for how to execute awesome combat.
Action movies show us awesome examples of what happens when characters are able to work together as a team. Think of all those awesome fight scenes where the protagonists are doing backflips off each other's backs, or throwing each other into combat, or using their abilities in tandem with each other, that it feels like everybody's on the rhythm of the battle. It's an awesomely cinematic way to have combat tactics bear out in the narrative in a rewarding way.
I'm thinking of that moment where the Avengers in the first movie finally get together, and there's that scene where Iron Man blasts into Captain America's shield as he throws it across all the enemies, and you have just all of these cool moments of the players playing off of each other. Avengers, that first Avengers movie, when they all finally get together for that final fight, is the pinnacle of teamwork D&D combat.
Having everybody on the same page, working together as a team, reduces conflict between the players at the table, and it makes combat encounters go much faster, because the players are able to fight through the battles fast and play out their turns even faster as well.
So this has been our first video on combat tactics in Dungeons & Dragons. We hope that you feel inspired to seize the day in combat.
And of course, we're just scratching the surface on all the awesome tactics and strategies that you can use in D&D 5th edition. We would like to hear your favorite tips and tricks in the comments below.
And if you want to watch us play D&D, you can check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim.
The campaign airs every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Twitch.
And because we looked at combat tactics today, if you're a player interested in how that works, you can check out Actions in Combat right up over here.
And we have a whole guide on running combat for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.